War of the Roses. The Wars of the Roses, fought between 1455 and 1487, were among the longest and bloodiest civil conflicts in medieval English history. More than a dynastic struggle between two rival branches of the Plantagenet royal family, the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and the House of York, by the white rose, the wars represented a profound political and social crisis. For over 3 decades, England was torn apart by intrigue, betrayal, and warfare, until Henry Tudor, representing the Lancastrian cause, defeated King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 and crushed the final Yorkist revolt at Stoke Field in 1487. His victory ended the Plantagenet era and inaugurated the Tudor dynasty, ushering in a new age of stability and centralized monarchy. The roots of the conflict lay in a collapse of royal authority following the death of King Henry V. His successor, Henry VI, was gentle but weak-willed, prone to bouts of mental illness, and incapable of effective rule. Power slipped into the hands of feuding nobles, especially Richard, Duke of York, a man of royal blood and formidable ambition. Economic decline after the 100 Years' War and the rise of private armies among local lords turned England into a patchwork of competing power bases. The feudal order wavered, faith in monarchy eroded, and the struggle for control of the throne gradually plunged the realm into chaos. The first battle broke out at St. Albans in 1455, when Yorkist forces defeated the royal army and captured Henry VI. It was the spark that ignited 30 years of turmoil. The bloodiest engagement, the Battle of Towton in 1461, left an estimated 28,000 men dead, the most lethal single day in English history. After Towton, Richard's son ascended as Edward IV and briefly restored stability. Yet his reign was plagued by political rivalry, particularly with the kingmaker Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who first restored Henry VI to the throne and then was overthrown himself. Upon Edward IV's death, the crown passed to his brother, Richard III, who seized power by declaring his young nephews illegitimate and confining them in the Tower of London, an act that shocked the nation. In 1485, Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant exiled in Brittany and Wales, landed in England, rallied support, and defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field. Richard's death ended the Yorkist dynasty. Henry's subsequent marriage to Elizabeth of York united the rival houses. Their symbols merged into the Tudor rose, red and white, entwined, signifying reconciliation and unity. The human and political loss was immense. Tens of thousands perished, many of them nobles and retainers. Great families were extinguished, and the aristocracy was reduced by nearly half. The countryside suffered plunder and famine. As king, Henry VII confiscated rebel estates, outlawed private armies, and concentrated military power under the crown reforms that laid the foundations of a strong, centralized state and effectively prevented future civil wars. In the long term, the wars accelerated England's transformation from a feudal to a centralized monarchy. Under the Tudors, especially Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, the kingdom became unified, prosperous, and increasingly powerful in European affairs. The downfall of the old feudal nobility allowed new social forces, merchants, administrators, and educated gentry to rise, paving the way for economic, religious, and maritime expansion in the 16th century. The lesson was unmistakable. When succession is uncertain and royal authority weak, a nation risks disintegration. Only a legitimate, centralized power can sustain lasting peace. Culturally, the Wars of the Roses left a lasting mark. The term itself was coined centuries later by the novelist Walter Scott, inspired by the rival floral emblems. William Shakespeare immortalized the era in his plays, Henry VI and Richard III, portraying human ambition, fate, and guilt amid the ruins of civil strife. The image of scheming nobles, doomed kings, and shifting loyalties has since become a powerful symbol of the transition from medieval to early modern England. Though drenched in blood and tragedy, the Wars of the Roses ultimately became a turning point in English history. They closed the chapter of feudal fragmentation and opened the age of the Tudors, a dynasty that restored order, reformed governance, and projected England onto the world stage. In the blended red and white Tudor rose, the English found not only a symbol of reconciliation between warring houses, but also the enduring hope of a kingdom rebuilt through unity and reform after the storm. Iran–Iraq War. The Iran–Iraq War, fought from 1980 to 1988, stands as one of the most brutal and prolonged conventional conflicts in the 20th century. For 8 relentless years, 2 neighboring nations, the Islamic Republic of Iran under Ayatollah Khomeini and the Republic of Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, poured their people, wealth, and ideological fervor into a war of attrition with no true victor. When the guns finally fell silent, what remained were devastated lands, millions of casualties, and a wound that has never fully healed in the modern history of the Middle East. The origins of the war lay in centuries-old territorial disputes, particularly over control of the Shatt al-Arab waterway, a vital artery for oil exports and national survival. After Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution toppled the pro-Western Shah and established a Shia theocracy, the new regime began supporting Shia movements abroad, including those within Iraq, where a Shia majority lived under the Sunni-dominated rule of Saddam Hussein. Fearing internal unrest and driven by ambition to assert regional dominance, Baghdad viewed revolutionary Iran as both a threat and an opportunity. The combination of border tensions, sectarian rivalry, and ideological confrontation turned the Persian Gulf into a tinderbox. In September 1980, Saddam launched a surprise invasion of Iran, convinced that the post-revolutionary turmoil had left the country vulnerable. Iraqi troops advanced rapidly across the border, capturing several key towns. Yet, within months, the offensive faltered. Iran rallied under Khomeini's call for resistance, and the fierce battle for Khorramshahr in late 1980 became a symbol of defiance, as thousands of soldiers on both sides perished fighting street by street. By 1982, Iran had regained most of its territory and began pushing into Iraq. What followed was a bloody stalemate. Both armies dug vast trench networks, unleashed artillery and missile barrages, and recreated on the desert plains the horrors reminiscent of World War I. Both nations waged a war of attrition that devoured an entire generation. Iran employed so-called human wave assaults, sending tens of thousands of volunteers, many of them teenage recruits, against Iraqi defenses. Saddam, in turn, resorted to the widespread use of chemical weapons, among the most heinous war crimes of the century. Cities were shelled, villages destroyed, and toxic clouds drifted over civilians. The borderlands became a vast minefield, where every meter of ground was soaked in blood. The cost was staggering. Around 1 million Iranians and nearly 500,000 Iraqis were killed. Countless others were wounded, disabled, or went missing. Millions of civilians were displaced, oil facilities burned, and both economies collapsed under the strain. When the United Nations finally brokered Resolution 598 calling for a ceasefire, both sides were exhausted. In August 1988, Iran and Iraq accepted a truce that restored pre-war borders. After 8 years, there were no victors, only 2 shattered nations. The repercussions of the conflict were far-reaching. The war left both countries weakened, creating a regional power vacuum and sowing the seeds of future instability. In Iran, the struggle was enshrined in state mythology as the imposed war, a sacred defense symbolizing national unity and faith. In Iraq, economic ruin and frustration drove Saddam Hussein to seek redemption through the invasion of Kuwait in 1990, plunging the region into another devastating war. The conflict served as a grim warning of the limits of violence and the dangers of mixing ideology and politics with unbridled ambition. Internationally, the Iran–Iraq War prompted renewed concern over weapons of mass destruction after Iraq's repeated use of chemical agents in blatant violation of the Geneva Conventions. It reshaped security dynamics in the Persian Gulf. Arab monarchies accelerated arms purchases, while Iran, isolated and under sanctions, turned inward, developing indigenous missile and defense programs that would later define its military doctrine. Culturally, the war became deeply embedded in the collective memory of both nations. In Iran, a culture of resistance took root, expressed through cinema, poetry, music, and annual commemorations of the martyrs. Memorial architecture and war museums emerged as pillars of national identity. Medically, The massive number of casualties and chemical victims spurred advances in reconstructive surgery, respiratory medicine, and battlefield trauma care, laying the foundations of Iran's modern military medicine. Viewed through the lens of history, the Iran-Iraq War was not merely an 8-year stalemate, but a turning point that reshaped the modern Middle East. It altered the regional balance of power, deepened the Sunni-Shia divide, and delivered harsh lessons about hubris, miscalculation, and the unbearable cost of war. More than 3 decades later, the waters of the Shatt al-Arab still carry echoes of that past, reminding humanity that when diplomacy yields to violence, every victory fades into illusion amid the sea of blood and ashes. Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War, 1936–1939, was one of the most brutal and haunting conflicts in 20th-century Europe. It was not merely a struggle for power within a single nation, but a clash of ideologies: democracy versus dictatorship, the left versus the right, progress versus reaction, that foreshadowed the greater storm soon to engulf the continent in World War II. What began as a failed military coup spiraled into a total civil war that claimed around 500,000 lives, forced millions into exile, and left wounds that would scar Spain for generations. The roots of the conflict lay in the collapse of the monarchy and the birth of the Second Republic in 1931. The new government pursued ambitious reforms, separating church and state, redistributing land, expanding women's suffrage, and granting autonomy to Catalonia and the Basque Country. Yet, these changes threatened the entrenched interests of the aristocracy, the Catholic Church, and the army, the traditional pillars of Spanish conservatism. At the same time, the Great Depression deepened political polarization. Violence between left and right-wing factions escalated, assassinations became commonplace, and the nation teetered on the edge of chaos. In July 1936, General Francisco Franco and other monarchist and fascist officers launched a military coup. The uprising succeeded only in part, dividing Spain in two. The Republicans, an uneasy coalition of workers, peasants, socialists, and communists, controlled Madrid, Barcelona, and the industrial regions, while the nationalists, under Franco, dominated the rural heartland and the south. Foreign powers soon intervened. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy supplied Franco with aircraft, tanks, and troops, while the Soviet Union backed the Republic. Tens of thousands of volunteers from across Europe and the Americas joined the international brigades, fighting for democracy and against fascism. The war became a grim rehearsal for World War II. New weapons, tanks, bombers, propaganda were tested on Spanish soil. One of the darkest moments came in 1937, when the German Condor Legion bombed the Basque town of Guernica, killing hundreds of civilians. Pablo Picasso immortalized the atrocity in his mural Guernica, transforming it into a universal anti-war symbol. Battles such as the Siege of Madrid and the struggle along the Ebro River turned Spain into a sea of blood, as entire villages and cities were destroyed. By early 1939, the nationalists captured Madrid, and Franco declared victory. Peace, however, came at the cost of silence. About 500,000 people died. Hundreds of thousands more were executed, imprisoned, or fled into exile. Many of them intellectuals, writers, and journalists whose absence plunged Spanish culture into a long night of repression. Franco's victory ushered in a dictatorship that lasted until 1975, founded on the alliance of church, army, and ultranationalism. Civil liberties vanished, censorship ruled, and dissent was ruthlessly punished. Spain remained politically and economically isolated from the democratic Europe that was rebuilding after the war. Only after Franco's death did the country begin its transition to democracy. Though the legacy of silence endured, thousands of mass graves remained unexcavated, and many crimes went unpunished. Efforts at reconciliation came decades later. The Historical Memory Law and the Democratic Memory Law formally recognized victims, funded exhumations, and required the teaching of Franco-era history in schools. Yet, these measures remain divisive between those who wish to forget and those who insist that true reconciliation demands justice. Amid the devastation, the war also produced remarkable human and intellectual legacies. In medicine, Physicians like Frederic Durand Jourda of Catalonia and Norman Bethune of Canada pioneered mobile blood transfusion services, a life-saving innovation later adopted in World War II. In art and literature, Picasso's Guernica, the poetry of Federico Garcia Lorca, and the eyewitness accounts of George Orwell and Ernest Hemingway turned the conflict into a universal symbol of courage, suffering, and the yearning for freedom. The Spanish Civil War, therefore, was not only a national tragedy, but also a mirror of its time, a moral crossroads where idealism and fanaticism, hope and despair collided. Its enduring lesson is clear. A society consumed by hatred and extremism cannot endure, and true peace can only be achieved when people confront their past openly, refusing to let memory sink into silence.